U.S. Army retired. David, we are so grateful for your support, and we really thank him for his commitment to helping bring this global education opportunity both to our community and to upstate South Carolina as a whole. So thank you so much, Colonel Davenport. We greatly appreciate your support. Now I'm going to turn this event over to our World Affairs Council Upstate Steering Board Chair, Rowan, and he'll introduce our speakers for the day.
Good afternoon. What a beautiful day we have here. And as we sit down for our lunch, I hope you have something very scrumptious in front of you to enjoy while you're hearing some incredible information. And again, thank you to my friend David Davenport for being our sponsor for this. Some of you may have met David. He has attended many of our America in the World series, and I think he got it, how important this was, and felt like he wanted to contribute and make sure that we continue doing it. So that's great. Thank you, David, and hopefully other people might be inspired to do the same thing. So let me start with introducing who we have. We have on the board of the World Affairs Council Upstate, and he himself is an incredible person. He's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, and he worked with the Carter Institute for many years. He served in a conflict resolution program that was out of Atlanta, Georgia, but he spent a lot of his time in Jerusalem and in the Gaza Strip. Plus, he's spent time working for USAID in Afghanistan. He is really a light in our community in terms of his international connections and what he's done. And so thank you, Nathan, for being moderator again. You might remember the great talk that Dr. Dripps did during last year, our series. He did it on global warming. It was fantastic. He took us through the science to understand how real this issue is to our planet. So now we're at part two with this talk, and it's really going to be interesting to see what's going on right now in the world with global warming, particularly relates to the COVID crisis. And remember, next week, and we'll mention it again, we'll have a follow-up with Bill Marshall and Dr. John Glenn, and we'll hear a little bit more who they are at the end of this. But so let me talk to you about, remind you who Dr. Dripps is. Dr. Weston Dripps is out of Furman University, and he is a hydrologist. That's his scientific background. He's been very passionate about studying Earth systems. So anyway, he has done work in the oil, gas, and water sector and environmental issues. And he has been known at Furman for his as an engaging teacher and active researcher. So I'm really excited to have him. He's also the executive director of the David Chai Center for Sustainability and a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Furman, as I said. So I think you're going to find him fascinating. He did a great job last time, and so we were so glad that he would be willing, that you would be willing, Weston, to come back and talk to us again. So after that, I say let's it all begin, and let's have a great time hearing and learning something on this great Earth Day.
Thanks very much, Rob. Just a couple quick procedural points, and then I'll turn it over to Wes. I would ask all our guests today to please keep your microphones muted and your video feeds off. Dr. Dripps is going to speak for 20-25 minutes, and in the course of his presentation or in the Q&A afterwards, everyone is welcome to type questions into the chat interface. Once Dr. Dripps has finished his opening remarks, I will read aloud questions more or less in chronological order as they come in. So again, feel free to type your questions in. There'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion, but kindly keep your microphones muted. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Weston Dripps.
Oh, excellent. Nate, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for Upstate International for having me. Really excited to be with you on this celebration of Earth Day. Hard to believe, 50 years. It's a big one, and here we are, all kind of sheltering in place. Sad that we can't be outside, so I encourage you all on this beautiful South Carolina day to at least get out for a short walk and maybe a little bit of time to reflect and think about yeah, how far we've come in the last kind of 50 years and maybe where we're headed to. I have three parts of the talk that I want to kind of share with you. Really, I think it's important to contextualize, particularly because this is such an important Earth Day, to tell you a little bit about where Earth Day came from and what its origins are, and highlight maybe some of the landmark legislation that has happened since we had that first Earth Day. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the implications of COVID and some of the fascinating science that's now emerging in light of this kind of sudden and unexpected pandemic that now we are in. And then I'll end with, I think, where we're headed in the future, kind of what do the next 50 years look like, and what might we be celebrating in 2070 when it comes along. So with that, why don't I start with the history and the origin, and just say this is the actual New York Times cover from April 23rd, 1970, the day after the very first Earth Day. And so it was probably much bigger than anyone had anticipated. And again, it had happened April 22nd, 1970. This is a picture from New York, but there were celebrations across all types of higher ed institutions and across many cities in the United States. You may say, how did we get to, and how was that first event so successful? Well, it had its roots really, if you look back, to a bunch of stuff that happened in the 1960s. So some of the pivotal moments in the 60s, Rachel Carson had published her now very famous Silent Spring, was the first to really call into question kind of our use of DDT widespread and widespread pesticide use. That was in 1962. Then there were actually two interesting events in the late 60s that I think ended up being the catalyst that prompted this widespread national event. January 28, 1969, there was an oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara. You can see here, actually, this is an oil rig, and they had a blowout. Much like kind of the Deepwater Horizon blowout, there was a blowout, and they tried to act quickly in terms of trying to contain the blowout, and they did a pretty good job, but in the process of actually containing the blowout, it caused a rupture in the sea floor actually over here, and oil and gas started pouring out actually into the ocean in response to that blowout. This got a lot of attention, as you might imagine, because that oil had to go somewhere. And even though this was offshore, it ended up on the beaches of Santa Barbara. And so very quickly, it found its way kind of into the national spotlight, where they had crews out there picking up all this black goo. They had those kind of iconic pictures of wildlife that were completely covered in black oil. And it began to really kind of, I think, touch a nerve with many, like, wow, we have real problems. We have to kind of do something about this. Later on in that year, there was a famous river that is now lived on in iconic fame as kind of also one of the catalysts, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, which is at the time was a real industrial river. There was a lot of steel mills, there were some paint factories and others that had for a long time actually used the river as kind of a dumping ground for a lot of the effluent coming out of them. It was pretty common at the time. That's how, it was the idea of kind of dilution's a solution to pollution, and the river would kind of flush itself out. But as you can see in this picture here, a lot of the effluent that was coming out was less dense in water, and so it began to accumulate here on the surface of the Cuyahoga River. In fact, this is almost like a thick oil that's there. And lo and behold, it wasn't the first time, but they believe a train probably would go on across the track, sparked a spark that landed on the top of the Cuyahoga River, and the whole thing caught fire. The 1969 fire on June 22nd happened to be the last time it caught fire, but believe it or not, there was no one there to actually take any pictures of it. They kind of put it out quickly. And the iconic image shown here on the screen actually dates back to a fire where the Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1952, 17 years prior to that. And you can imagine, I think for many, the idea of a river, a water body catching fire really kind of awoke a lot of folks saying, wow, we have real problems. This is something that we really need to do something about. And so again, there were these series of events that happened in the 60s that I think then prompted Gaylord Nelson, who was a young senator from Wisconsin at the time. He was interested in trying to transition what had been, I think, some of the student protests from the Vietnam War era, and trying to find a new cause for them. And he partnered with a student, a grad student, Dennis Hayes, and the two of them set out to actually do a teach-in on college campuses. That was kind of the goal. And they decided on April 22nd, it was kind of an interesting choice. They wanted to maximize the number of students they thought that could actually participate. So they chose it strategically between spring break and final exams, and figured if we found somewhere kind of a sweet spot in the middle, we had the best chance of not competing with final exams and students weren't off on spring break. And so they chose April 22nd as the day. Dennis Hayes really mobilized the nation. I mean, it was amazing that he actually, in a relatively short amount of time, was able to catalyze that event that started that very first Earth Day. And as I mentioned, they had about 20 million Americans, which at the time was about 10% of the US population, participated in this, both on college campuses and cities across the United States. So, I mean, just a monumental event. But I think, again, it has been seen as that launch of Earth Day was really the beginning of what we have as the modern environmental movement. I mean, that really is always seen as that start of really an amazing decade in the 1970s that followed, where there was a lot of landmark legislation that was passed that wasn't totally due to that, but certainly that effort really, I think, brought it to the limelight and brought the attention of Richard Nixon and his administration. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was founded then in 1970. That's Williams Ruckelshaus on the right, and Nixon obviously on the left. And with the EPA and Nixon's administration, there was a whole series of legislation that came out that really focused on trying to improve both air quality, but water quality, protecting the oceans, endangered species. You see the litany of list over here, and I won't go through all these, but I want to just highlight what I thought were some of the key moments. And a lot of that happened here in the 70s, shortly after kind of that first Earth Day. We've had a whole series of other events, some that have been more catastrophic types of events that, again, have continued to bring the environmental issues not only to the US, but to globally. And I would say, you know, the Stockholm Conference with the founding of UNEP really was the predecessor to a lot of the ongoing work now to this day by the IPCC and others around climate change. So it's been a really interesting and kind of long journey. And we've come a long way. I would say we've had some good successes, but we certainly have challenges that still face us. So I'm going to pivot now and say, where are we here in 2020? This was a hilarious, sadly hilarious piece that was run, or a cartoon that I saw in a newspaper just the other day that was trying to celebrate Earth Day 2020. We've got less industrial pollution, less air pollution from cars, less pollution at airports, less litter. And oh, by the way, it just took a global pandemic shutdown to actually get us to that point. So we have come a long way, but there still is a lot of room to grow. And I think in many ways, a lot of the challenges we faced in the 70s were more kind of the point source end, where it was easier to kind of identify the problem and regulate it and put forth good policy. But now as we transition to some of these global issues like climate change, they're much more complex, it's much more complicated, it really is more of a global endeavor. Before I highlight some of the thing on climate change, I thought I'd share what I thought have been some of the interesting things that have come out of the pandemic, some that are kind of interesting and maybe you've seen yourself. One is, it really has highlighted, I think to me, just how big the human footprint is when we are in kind of full production mode, and how quickly the earth can be fairly resilient in terms of temporarily cleaning itself up when we shut that down. This is an image from an article that looks at what happened in China following the pandemic. This is looking at a lot of the particulate matter. This happens to be nitrogen dioxide, but think of it as kind of air particulates that really are pervasive across China and really degrade their air quality pretty significantly for those that are living there and breathing it. And then here's that same area literally a month later, kind of following the pandemic and what that shut down. When you stop all the transportation, you shut down industry, the system actually clears itself up pretty quickly. I saw a similar article just yesterday that was saying now that India, who's another one of these rapidly kind of growing areas, this is a graph that shows, again, think of it as kind of air pollution or particulates. This is kind of the range from the last 3 or 4 years. And here's where they initiated the lockdown. And lo and behold, I mean, look how quickly the particulates kind of dropped and the air quality kind of has significantly improved across large parts of India. If you're not a chart person, the pictures are worth 1,000 words. And so here's the India Gate under a normal day, kind of pre-COVID. This is what it's looking like now, where that there is really not that particulate matter and that haze that kind of typically envelops the India Gate. You can look across Europe as well. Here's the Eiffel Tower, and this again is, so here we are in Paris, kind of pre-COVID, and then you can look at what it looks like now in terms of, you know, it's really kind of cleared itself up fairly immensely because nothing's happening. The industry's not happening, the transportation and all that burning of fossil fuels and emissions that go with it are simply on hold at this point. It's not just air pollution though. I saw article talking that I think Venice, typical, hopefully my internet connection is showing unstable. Hopefully you're still with me. This is all the boat traffic actually through Venice with all the cruise ships and all the tourists that go through. And notice in particular, look how murky the water actually is because all those boats are churning everything up. This is a picture just recently without all the boats. And I mean, you can see the water clarity has improved immensely. I don't think it's changed the water chemistry and that the water pollution is necessarily any less. But without all that motor traffic and boat traffic, it's amazing how all that sediment in particular is settled out. And scientists have been fascinated to see, they can see the bottom in some areas, they can see seaweed, they've seen kind of wildlife that's probably been there all the time, but is always kind of cluttered by the chaos of the boat traffic that follows. The other series of things that I found funny is, you know, when humans shelter in place, it's amazing how the animal kingdom will take back over. And there's been a whole series of images that have emerged. These are coyotes hanging out in the streets of San Francisco with the Golden Gate Bridge there on the back. Here are lions sunning themselves in South Africa on the streets because no one's on the streets anymore. So they've decided to lounge kind of there. And then an article I read yesterday talking about how they think this is going to be a banner year for sea turtles with everyone being off the beaches, that the hazards that typically happen from people swimming and occupying their egg nesting areas have been minimized. And so they're hoping for kind of really a major bounce back in terms of sea turtle populations, which again, kind of unexpected, but maybe one of the silver linings and benefits that come out in terms of that. And then even locally, I have a friend in Asheville who said, hey, look, I've been noticing the bears have gotten much more bold. There's just not a lot of people out there, and the usual chaos and traffic that scares them away, they are now taking up camp in a lot of the neighborhoods and mulling themselves around. So I found that kind of interesting. It's amazing how quick animals will kind of reoccupy when humans vacate kind of that space. I'd be remiss as a geologist not to share this one. This might be of less interest to some of you, but there was a study that came out of Belgium that was showing that all the human activity creates an actual seismic noise from all of our moving around. And now that everyone is kind of sheltering in place, that there's actually less ambient seismic noise. And a lot of the seismologists and geologists have been able to actually detect much more micro earthquakes and things that normally were getting drowned out by just the overall movement of human activity. And so there's been some interesting scientific research kind of looking at how do we take advantage of this little moment to kind of look at what this inactivity kind of allows us to see. And similarly, a bunch of ornithologists and bird experts have found that the city soundscapes have changed so drastically. And so some fascinating stories about capturing birds actually in big cities like New York or other places in China where the birds have probably always been there, but their communicating and soundscape has always been overrun by the hustle and bustle of kind of urban life. And now all of a sudden they're being able to capture and record what these natural city soundscapes actually might sound if you took the human element kind of out, which I found, again, just kind of fascinating. I will say one or two things about kind of Earth Day 2020. So climate action is the focus for Earth Day. So Yeah, there's some interesting good news, but I really will leave us with kind of an open-ended question we can come back to in Q&A. I did want to share, people always ask, so I'll refer you back to the talk I gave in particularly because it's unlikely this is a long-term change, right? At some point, I think many feel this is a pause, and that when we lift the shelter in place, unfortunately, maybe, you know, we'll probably be back to business as usual in some capacity with regards to emissions. My question to you all, and this is one we can come back to, Nathan, is, you know, where do we go from this current shutdown? Do we use this as an opportunity to really innovate for the future? Is this the linchpin that allows us to maybe revisit our dependence on fossil fuels, and some of these decreases we see end up being more of a switch in the trend to more of a long-term phasing out of fossil fuels? Or do we just kind of fall back into where we were before and everyone's kind of in a holding pattern, and lo and behold, a few months from now, we're back to kind of emissions where we were before? I don't have an answer for that. But I want to leave my last comments saying, where are we going? So the exciting piece on this is I want to share a little of the work we're doing at Furman. So I'm part of a department, the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, that about almost a decade ago founded a new major in sustainability science. So you can come to Furman and get a Bachelor of Science degree in sustainability science. Sustainability science as a discipline is fascinating to me because it doesn't just focus on the environmental component. It looks at that human natural system kind of coupling that drives pretty much what we see today. There are different ways to think of sustainability. This is probably the one that many are familiar with, the kind of three-legged stool with environment, economy, and society. This has actually become now known as weak sustainability because I would argue, and we can again talk more about this, that it really isn't a three-legged stool with all the legs being equal, that it really is more of a system of maybe embedded circles where the environment in fact is the more important of the two, with the economy and the society being kind of embedded in that environment. And if you undermine or destroy the environment, that at some point the economy and society will probably follow. We do need to pivot from the more linear chain supply systems we have here to a more circular system that is going to take a while for us to do. But the basics of the disciplines are like trying to look at this more integrated systems kind of thinking approach to how we begin to think about some of these problems. The best way, I think, to kind of highlight this is some work that Kate Raworth, who's a British economist, has done. I love this graph, and I can share certainly her work, or you can Google her if you want to have a look. But her suggestion is that the goal really for us as a species and humankind moving forward is how do we live within the confines of a single planet? How do we stay within this ecological ceiling that is put upon us by a single kind of finite planet? But realizing that we want to improve the quality of life for the world's people, right? So there are these kind of apparently competing interests in terms of improving the social foundation on this inner part of this donut, but doing it within the confines of this outer part of the donut. And if we can end up in this sweet space in the middle where we get everyone to some kind of base social foundation and do it within the confines of a single planet, then we have actually reached the safe and just space for humanity where we all want to kind of end up being. The sad news is we have work to do because we've already exceeded many of the ecological ceiling parameters, whether that's climate change or biodiversity loss or land impact, still have yet to really meet the basic human social foundation for everyone on the planet. So we have room to do on both, but that really is where we're kind of headed to and headed for. So I leave you with a kind of a question on this celebration of Earth Day 50 years later. Is change possible? Certainly. I mean, I think there's been a lot of great progress that has happened along the way. We do know things won't get better if we do nothing. So it's not whether you can personally make a difference, but do you want to be the person who tries? I think we need to kind of get beyond the defeatist attitude. And I want to leave you with a little bit of hope and share with you that there is opportunity for you locally to get involved. So I direct an institute. It's actually right now the Shi Center for Sustainability, and I'm really excited to share with you that this fall we'll be launching actually and elevating that 10 years of the Shi Center's legacy to a new institute called the Shi Institute for Sustainable Communities. We're in that transition period right now, but we're actively looking for advisory board members and founding donors. But I'd love for you to join me on this journey and come out and visit with us once the shelter in place is kind of lifted, and share with you some of the great work we're doing here across the upstate. My hope is that in 2070, we're back together again, kind of looks. And that, I'll turn it over to you, Nathan. I'll leave my contact info there on the screen, both in terms of email, but you can certainly join us on social media from Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram if you would like to join our newsletter or hear more about what the Institute is going to be up to.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dripps. That was extremely thought-provoking and timely. I would like to use my prerogative as moderator to share an opening question, and then I'll turn it over to anyone else who might want to type questions into the chat feature. Just another reminder to please keep your microphones muted. I really appreciated, Dr. Dripps, your backstory on the origins of Earth Day, most of which I wasn't aware of. It was also a nice reminder that the EPA was founded in the Nixon administration. It seemed to harken back to a time when environmental protection was more of a nonpartisan issue than it has become in US politics today. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about what might be done to remove these questions of sustainability from our partisan divides, to get this back to an issue that has kind of a national foundation of support.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, I highlighted this when we talked in October, and it saddens me as a scientist that we've taken a lot of these kind of scientific issues around like climate change in particular and turned them into partisan issues. And I realize that there's a policy decision making as to maybe the partisanship comes down to, you know, how do we move forward? Where are the policy decisions and options? And I know next week you guys are going to be talking more about kind of carbon markets. I know that's certainly a hot topic in terms of looking at as a possible solution. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wish I had, it's sad. I mean, I think it's a broader state of politics that everything's become partisan and you get both sides kind of digging in. I hope, you know, from the beauty of sustainability and from sustainability sciences, it is kind of an all hands needed. And so these are systems that are not going to be solved by any either one discipline or one party or one person even. And I love the rallying call kind of around sustainability as, you know, it requires everyone around the table. It requires all the stakeholders. It requires both the business interests as well as the environmentalist, as well as the, you know, the everyday citizen. If we're really going to make any movement, we've got ourselves in this kind of impasse right now. I've seen it in climate change legislation where we're in this, it is a gridlock and neither side seems to want to budge. And each side's kind of digging in. I don't know how, honestly, you know, that's not my realm necessarily. I don't know how we get out. I will say as a scientist, I'm going to stay true to the data-driven kind of solutions-oriented work that we do and stay true to the science and kind of stay in that bubble and that realm and do my best to communicate that to the masses as best I can.
Great. Well, our first question comes from Rob Rowan, the chair of the World Affairs Council Steering Board. he is wondering how you think publics will respond in the post-lockdown era when pollution levels rise again. I mean, thinking of your really interesting graphic of changes in air quality in China, do you anticipate there might be a backlash when Beijing is again covered in smog, and might that lead to some kind of constructive change?
That'd be great. I mean, again, yeah, you would hope it would be a catalyst. I mean, again, I think as I showed you, even with the imagery, I mean, it's the everyday citizen is seeing that improvement, right? I mean, it's not like there's this hidden kind of difference. The problem with sometimes like CO2 and stuff is I can show you the data, but it's harder to visually kind of see what an improvement looks like. If I'm on the ground and I have all this particulate matter and normally I can't see, you know, a mile or half a mile or even hundreds of feet away, and all of a sudden, in this pandemic, all of a sudden I realize how quick and how resilient that system can be. I would hope that would get the everyday person who maybe has been a little bit more indifferent on it to kind of say, wait a second, remember how great that was? I think that the challenge that we really face is this pandemic really has caused a massive shutdown. I'm not sure it's not due, the cleanup isn't due to changes in policy yet. It isn't changes really in behavior that are behaviors that people are choosing to make. It hasn't been all of a sudden a radical shift to kind of renewables. So the sad thing, and I think the challenging thing is, I mean, we're seeing what happens when you quickly mobilize and shut the whole system down. And I think if anything, it highlights how big our human footprint is. So I'm hoping that would be a catalyst to kind of, again, maybe this is one of these pivotal moments, kind of like that first Earth Day, where we, you know, empower again that youth movement, but even beyond that youth movement to kind of take a stand and say, hey, we saw how quickly the system can kind of respond, in particular in certain things like air particulates or water quality. I would love for that. I think the jury's out. I don't know. I mean, I think there's so many unknowns as to where we're headed in the next couple months. And again, do we pivot in a way that helps improve the system, or do we see almost like a backlog of factories that are all of a sudden now working double time to kind of catch up to all the lost business? And I think there's some concern that that may happen too. It may get much worse in the short term when we kind of pull out of this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Tracy Fries, director of Upstate International. She asks, Dr. Dripps, what do you think about the Trump administration making changes to existing environmental legislation and regulations during the COVID crisis? There's been some reporting, for example, about recent regulatory changes allowing drilling in previously protected natural areas.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'll say again, I try to steer clear of a lot of the politics of things as the scientist in me. But you know, I'd be remiss to say, sure. I mean, we got to keep our eye on that very carefully. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think some people we're all caught up in kind of COVID. There is legislation and rollbacks and other stuff that's happening right now that I know a lot of environmental groups have really tried to highlight. Some of the ones that you actually just kind of mentioned. Yeah, I mean, that would be tragic. I mean, I really think we've come a long way. Our policies and our regulations have actually shown significant progress. If we start dialing those back for special interests, I think that's a serious problem. It'll be interesting to see, you know, on a similar topic, you probably saw that the price of oil went negative a couple days ago. I mean, that's insane when you really think about it. But you know, right now we're just not using that all, so we have more oil on hand than no one's out to actually buy it or utilize it. It'll be interesting to see what happens to the fossil fuel sector in terms of, you know, what role does our government play? Do they try to bail out the oil giants, or is this again maybe a time to pivot and kind of move away from our fossil fuel dependence? I don't know. But no, I encourage you all, watch that legislation carefully. I mean, I understand that it is unusual times and there's certain things that maybe have to be done in the short term. But it would be a real shame if some of these things that are happening become kind of, you know, a longer term thing, and COVID's just kind of a cover to kind of get some things done that really shouldn't be happening or don't need to happen.
Yeah. One of our guests, Sitara, notes the significant negative environmental impacts from animal agriculture. The use of water, grains, deforestation that underpin our current food production systems globally. So Sitara asks, what are your thoughts from an environmental perspective regarding moving away from an animal-based food system toward a more plant-based food system?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think students and community members always come and ask me, like, if there's one thing that I could do from a personal standpoint in terms of if you're really trying to look at the holistic kind of impact, particularly around the environment, what's the one thing I could do? And, you know, they'll say, oh, should I take shorter showers? Should I switch to CFL light bulbs? Should I compost? And, you know, again, the scientific data is overwhelming. Diet change. And then the choice of diet is probably the single biggest impact if you want to kind of are concerned about kind of that cascading impact, in particular the environmental impacts that are associated with our food production system. I'm not saying you all need to become vegetarians or even vegans or anything like that. Even if you can dial back the number of meat-based meals that you're eating by a few, if we could scale that, it would be astronomically significant, not only in terms of the climate change impacts, but all these other impacts around water quality in particular, or even air quality and stuff as well. So I think that's a great, you know, that's, again, if there's one thing that you can do, I think that is one that is probably more important and doesn't get reported on nearly as much. We tend to focus on recycling and, you know, the things that seem the feel good, more tangible, kind of smaller things as opposed to a full dietary shift. If everyone was to move to a Western-based diet, it would be catastrophic. We don't have the actual resources, I think, across the planet to support that diet. And we're seeing that happen as many developing countries are aspiring to be more like the US. There is this shift into a more Western diets, finding their way into those cultures. And that's not good in terms of the impacts. Yeah, I can share some resources with her if she wants to reach out with me. There's a lot been written about the impacts of a meat-based or a heavy meat-based diet.
Okay, thank you. Mike Winooski writes, the examples of quick environmental change that we've seen in the last month might lend themselves to an argument that the Earth, that our environmental systems can bounce back regardless of what humans do or the policy decisions we make. How would you counter that argument? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think we got to be careful on that. I mean, again, although I showed you some pictures there of how quickly like air quality and air pollution can bounce back in a place like China or India, I want to kind of pivot to the slides I showed you around kind of carbon dioxide in particular. So if you look at a lot of the issues that are driving climate change around our greenhouse gases, these are gases that accumulate over time and they don't just disappear. I mean, they have longevities in the atmosphere of decades plus, hundreds of years in some cases. So yes, we can see some kind of small incremental kind of quick successes with regards to, say, like particulate matter or soot or things like that are a direct result of that. But again, it's been a relatively small change in the grand scheme of looking at climate change. I don't want people to walk away from this kind of saying, hey, look, you know, look how successful it is. We're going to kind of all of a sudden drop our emissions or our carbon dioxide levels down to 350. This would have to be a long, systemic, sustained change that would have to, you know, if we were to continue where we are now and have a shutdown, sure, we would begin to probably see that decrease. But you're talking, again, a good distance out in terms of the lag effect before we would really see something that quick and rapid. It's just not, the system's too big. It doesn't happen that quickly.
Another guest, Laura, asks if the Shi Center is working to push the state of South Carolina to promote the use of solar and wind power.
Yeah, I mean, so again, we have a from a campus standpoint, we're really interested in renewables. If you've been up to our campus, we have that 5-acre solar farm that we were able to put in right at the entrance. So yeah, the center is always advocating, I would say, certainly we have aspirations to be carbon neutral as a campus, and the only way to really get there is going to have to be transition ourselves from our kind of fossil fuel based electricity system that we currently get, and working with Duke Energy to kind of begin to pivot that to more solar or wind. Here in the upstate, solar probably is more likely. We don't have a lot of wind prospects, but depending where you are, if you're down on the coast or other areas. Yes, I mean, I'd say historically we haven't been as involved as a center. We've been a little bit more campus centric. I will say the exciting thing with the Institute is pivoting us more in terms of being a bigger player probably at the state level, and working, you know, with the various community partners and governments out there in terms of trying to get South Carolina in particular to pivot. We're primed for solar. I mean, we really have a lot of potential. And I know there is current legislation called the Green Source Advantage that you can have, and we've been following very closely, that would allow more widespread purchase of solar energy in particular to offset kind of your electricity purchase. That is hopefully coming down the pipeline. It's been kind of held up back and forth in the comment period now, and we're holding out hope that that will happen so we can, Furman in particular, but others could enter into kind of longer term power purchase agreements around things like renewable energies and solar or wind.
Another guest, Michael Brown, has a question regarding the role of smaller farms versus larger scale industrial agriculture. He notes that there has been more of a surge in production from smaller farmers. Where do you see this going? Do you see smaller farms as being a more environmentally friendly step forward and a step away from the agribusiness of the last century?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, again, I think one of the things that's been exposed with the COVID crisis is how globalized our food supply chain currently is. You know, there are many markets that are running out of things that people are accustomed to eating. But again, when you shut down the transportation mechanisms to get that stuff around the world or the country, then they can't make it there. So I think it speaks to and helps kind of reality. You know, if we had a more localized food economy, that wouldn't be a problem, right? Because we'd be able to kind of get it where it needs to go. I've been really excited, and we've certainly been heavily involved in watching the local food system grow here across the upstate. I mean, the number of farmers markets and this resurgence, particularly I see in our student populations of students who want to actually go into farming, is something that I've seen over the last 15 years since I've been at Furman. That's been really exciting to see. I think in terms of the environmental impacts, I mean, it still comes down to how is that local farmer farming. Certainly the localization of that has a whole lot of added benefits in terms of food miles traveled to market, you know, if it's going right to a farmer's market, in terms of freshness of the produce, in terms of supporting the local economy. There are a whole lot of benefits. I guess the sticking point would be is, you know, is it better to buy organic that traveled further versus non-organic that was local? I mean, you probably need to look at the full life cycle in those. So local is definitely better than far away. But there, again, how that food is actually raised is something that we can't forget as well. So it's not just whether it's local, but was it sustainable? Is it more of a sustainable ag model, or are you using heavy pesticides, fertilizers, et cetera, that really would have all the same impacts that a large commercial ag system might have as well?
Tracy Fries with Upstate International has two questions. She asks, to what extent do you think industry is making strides toward addressing climate change willingly? To what extent, you know, is there real industrial buy-in to these policy and environmental changes? And are there signs of improvement in the US and globally in terms of emissions and the effort at carbon reduction?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think even though the challenges ahead are quite hard. I mean, I think we have to stop to celebrate sometimes how far we've come. I mean, you saw the pictures I was showing you from the 70s of, I mean, yes, we still have terrible problems with water quality, and yes, we still have air quality problems, but it's significantly better than it was kind of back then. So I think we can't kind of forget that in terms of just how far both the regulation, but industry and others have come too. I follow very closely. There are a lot of, I think where a lot of the innovation and excitement is among industry are companies now that are taking a much more holistic look at their full product lifecycle analysis. So you can look at, a variety of different companies that have not just thought about kind of what it takes to make their product at their factory, but where are they sourcing that material from, and then what's happening to that material kind of on the back end. We work very closely with Interface Carpets, which is, again, I highly encourage you to go look up Ray Anderson, who was kind of one of the pioneers in the industrial world about, he took the carpet industry, which had typically been a very singular kind of linear chain where, you get the materials, you'd make the carpet, and then you'd hand it to the homeowner who would send it to the landfill when it was done, and really change it to a more closed loop kind of circular system. They're doing some fascinating work. I was just talking with a few members of them recently. They're talking about actually developing carpet that embeds more carbon than is utilized in the whole process of actually making the carpet. It actually is becoming a carbon sink, which is pretty phenomenal. So there are, I do think we're moving that way. The beauty of sustainability and sustainability science is, I think, people are beginning to look at a little bit more true cost accounting, more kind of cradle to cradle kind of approaching or approaches in terms of understanding that we need to look at the full kind of life cycle of a product. Landfills are getting expensive, right? And if we can keep stuff out of the landfill and be more creative around that, it's going to save everyone money kind of in the long run. I think there's also been a big move around. A lot of companies are paying a lot more attention, particularly among the younger generation that's coming up, about how they're going to invest their money. And so ESG investing, or, socially responsibly investing, is becoming a much bigger thing. And even if a company is doing really well, I think you're seeing more and more of this younger generation that are making a conscious choice and saying, yes, I could invest in an oil company that might have high returns, but I'm philosophically and morally not going to do that because I don't want to support, the impacts of climate change. Mm-hmm. So, I've seen the divestment movement across college campuses really kind of grow, and even this discussion about thinking about how people are investing their money, both at a grand scale, but an individual scale as well. And I know companies are taking notice of that. They're starting to realize that investors are asking questions that they weren't asking 5 years ago about issues of sustainability.
We're running out of time, so this is going to have to be our last question for the afternoon. This again comes from Tracy Fries. Other than changes in diet and the food system, what do you see as the top ways regular folks can make changes in their home lives to reduce their environmental impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as much of a, I don't know if there is no silver bullet. I mean, there's no kind of like one thing. I think I would encourage you as a homeowner, especially as you have this time to shelter in place, to maybe even audit yourself a little bit and take a look at those everyday decisions that you make about your overall lifestyle. Whether showers are, whether it's how many lights you're leaving on around the house that you probably have gotten in habit because they're on a timer or something like that, that you could scale back on. How many times are you using your dryer? I mean, I don't think we take enough time in the busyness of our lives to often take time to reflect on looking at the impact of every lifestyle choices. And it's a great time now, I think, to kind of do that self-audit. It would, if you could make small changes in each of those capacities, I think you'll be surprised at not only the money it can save you. I mean, there are financial savings associated with it, but certainly environmentally as well. I realize that a lot of the things you were mentioning before, Nathan, are, I don't think small individual changes are necessarily going to fundamentally change our transportation system and some of the other bigger things out there. But also don't want people to feel disempowered. I mean, if everyone did this and we scaled it, you'd be blown away at the savings that could be realized from dietary changes and water saving changes. That again, it's not. I'm not asking you to go back to living in a hut and eating twigs and berries. I realize that people have a certain lifestyle, but there is a lot of opportunity, I think, individually for you to kind of realize savings.
I think we have time for one last question that I wanted to get in there. This came from Carol. She asked, have you noticed efforts to make medical products more sustainable or reusable? There tends to be a practice in the medical industry of throwing a lot of stuff away and making single-use products. Any change there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will say I haven't followed medical waste personally very carefully, but I will tell you something that I found fascinating. So I mentioned we have this major in sustainability science at Furman, and people always ask me, like, where are students ending up when they come out of Furman with a sustainability science degree? What are some of the industries that they have gravitated to? And one of the ones I had not expected, and we've had numerous students now have gone into the hospital systems. So they are hospitals, a lot of big hospitals are now looking to hire sustainability coordinators, not just to help on the waste, but to help with kind of the whole systems analysis. So that's been kind of exciting. Medical waste is tricky, again, because it is kind of a unique waste stream that is fundamentally different than the typical everyday kind of homeowner waste stream or even a lot of our industrial waste stream. And it has to be handled kind of in a different way. It can't really find its way into the typical kind of mainstream. I will say on the flip side, think of how many hospitals there are across the country. And so small changes in terms of how we handle things can, again, scale pretty immensely and have huge impacts. I have not, like I said, I don't know the specifics as to what they've been doing in the hospitals around those, but I think it's an area of huge interest. And again, I think hospitals are thinking about this stuff very much more so than maybe they used to, but more proactively about trying to think about not just the waste stream on the back end, but proactively, how do we change what's going into that waste stream at the front end? Can we source things more sustainably? Can we have things that are reusable so that we're not just generating large volumes of waste coming out of those systems that now have to be handled on the back end? So again, it's that pivot to go from, I'd say, more of that linear way of thinking to can we begin to think about the waste stream as a really kind of a circular system. Having people from procurement talk to people who are the actual waste folks on the back end, they should be in the same room having these discussions together, not kind of in isolation or at opposite ends of that supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Dripps, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great.
It's been great. And I will say happy 50th Earth Day. And I actively encourage you all to get out and take in just how amazing a day it is and really take some time to reflect about Earth Day. It's something that doesn't get celebrated as much as it should. And so I encourage you to take a little pause or reflection today to do so.
Yeah, and on that note, I would like to invite all of you to join us at this same time next week, a week from today at noon. That's the 29th. We will have Bill Marshall with the Citizens Climate Lobby and Dr. John Glenn with the Global Leadership Coalition and George Washington University. They will be discussing carbon emissions in the US and the developing world. For more information, please see our website, the World Affairs Council Upstate. Thank you all so very much for joining us.
And Nate, I'd say one last thing. If anyone wants to follow up on anything or hear more about the Institute, please don't be bashful to go ahead and contact me via the email or connect via social media. I'd love to talk further about where we're headed.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Dripps.